So I finished breaking in the R80ST. Now I originally planned to auction the bike on Bring a Trailer and donate all the proceeds to the Motorcycle Relief Project. However, Darren Dorton with the Type 247 podcast did a podcast about completing the project and brought this to the attention of Ted Moyer, who's the executive director of the BMW Motorcycle Owners Association, known as the MOA. Ted got in touch with me and said that the BMW Foundation had been supporting the Motorcycle Relief Project and that he was very interested in my project and my goal of donating all the proceeds to them. So he asked me if I would be interested in allowing the MOA to hold a raffle for the bike, and I agreed, because I think a raffle may generate much more contribution to the Motorcycle Relief Project than just selling it on Bring a Trailer, and more people have an opportunity to win this bike. So that's what we've agreed to do. The raffle will be held in December and January, and the MOA webpage will have details of how you can buy a raffle ticket. So everything's on track now for the bike to be sold and the proceeds to be donated to the Motorcycle Relief Project. After the first engine start, I rode the bike about 10 miles, and I really wasn't able to get it into first gear. So when I got back from that ride, I checked and found that the linkage was interfering. And so what had happened is I hadn't adjusted it so the shift lever was high enough. So I made the adjustment, and then it went into first gear, easy peasy. Then I rode it for another 10 miles after that to warm it all up, and then went in and balanced the carbs with my Grok carb balancer. They were close, but they needed some adjustment, and in particular the throttle cable needed to be a little bit more adjusted so that the upper RPMs were balanced. Now after that, I went over to the local gas station about a half mile away, because I'd never really filled the tank, filled it up, and something exciting happened. I had gas coming down the tank, dripping on the ground on the right side of the tank. So it was only a half mile of the house. So with the gas dripping, I rode back and took a look, and up here is where the bracket on the front goes on that rubber bumper to mount the front of the tank on the frame, and it looked like there was gas coming out around the bracket. So I took the tank off and drained it first, then took it off, and I could see what looked like a cracked weld where the bracket was welded to the tank. So I used a little JB weld, filled that all in, and tested the tank, put a little gas in it, tipped it forward so the gas was all around the front of the tank, let it sit on my workbench for an hour, and no leak. So then I filled the tank all the way up, and after another almost 900 miles, there's been no leak in the tank. So that problem has been fixed. Now at about 50 miles after I'd gotten the tires kind of scrubbed in, I started leaning more aggressively into corners, and I started to hear a grinding sound. So I came back to the shop, and it suddenly was clear that the center stand wasn't retracting all the way, and the problem was the foot on the center stand was just touching the rear end of the exhaust collector. So I loosened up the fittings and drove the collector further up the header pipes, and now the center stand clears. So that problem got fixed. Now at 90 miles, the mirror here just started wobbling and wouldn't hold its place. and I took a look, and there's a nut here that puts pressure on the mirror and squeezes it against its ball, and so I just had to tighten that up. Minor little fix. Now at about 130 miles, I had noticed some stiffness and vibration in the front end, and I wasn't quite sure what was going on. So I pulled the wheel off and rebalanced it. It wasn't quite perfect, and I did the same with the rear wheel, and that didn't actually fix the problem. So later on, I went back and talked with Matt Isles and had him ride the bike, and he said, "Brooke, there's just a tremendous amount of fork stiction, and you know, you really ought to just see if you can find out why that is." So I took off the wheel and checked the alignment on the forks, and they were correct. And then I recalled that when I had measured the fork tubes for flat, there were some kinks in them, and I finally concluded that that must be why I was having so much fork stiction. So I went ahead and replaced the fork tubes, and I also went ahead and replaced what's called the bow, but it's the lower fork brace that the fender mounts to, because the one I was using was a free one a friend gave me, but it had a little bit of a kink in it. So now the front end is much smoother. Now at 150 miles, it became clear that my gas mileage was about 30 miles to the gallon, which is terrible. And I was running 150 main jets. There also were 135 main jets shown for this bike. So I changed out the jets to 135 and improved the mileage to almost 40 miles to the gallon, essentially increased it by 33%. So the rest of the digging into the information I did revealed that BMW had a problem with the R80 engines running way too rich, and they ultimately made a different carb for the bike, a different carb model, but what that carb model had was 135 main jets. So making that transition was the right thing to do. Now at 200 miles, I drained the oil, the transmission, the drive shaft, and the rear drive lube, because I wanted to get any debris or anything out of there. After changing the fluids, then I pulled the valve covers and checked the valve clearances, and they had tightened up. So before I did anything, I also checked that the head stud nuts were torqued properly, but they'd gotten loose as well. So I torqued all the head nuts back to 25 foot-pounds, and then reset the valves to 6,000th on the intake and 8,000 on the exhaust, which is the recommended setting during break-in, and continued to ride the bike. And at 400 miles, I checked the valves again. They tightened up just a little bit, and the nuts and all for holding the heads on had just loosened a little bit. So I retorqued them and reset the valves again. And at that point I noticed that the front of the side cover here on the left wasn't really staying on the rubber grommet. So I removed it and used some Plast-Aid and basically created a plastic ring all the way around the grommet to hold it firmly on the cover. And then I install the cover from the front, push it on, and then snap the bottom one on here, and everything's fine now. Now the gas mileage at 400 miles was still about 40 miles to the gallon, and I live in Denver, so I'm a mile high, and I frequently ride up around 9,000 or 10,000 feet. So I decided to drop the jet needle down one more notch from position 3 to position 2. See if that improves the gas mileage. Now at 600 miles, BMW considers the bike broken in, and at that point I was getting 45 miles to the gallon, and I checked the plugs and they looked good. So I think the change of main jet and dropping the needle have been the right things to do. Now once again, I drained the engine oil, transmission, drive shaft, rear drive, and changed the oil filter and filled it all up with fresh fluid. There wasn't a lot of shavings, a little bit on the transmission, none on the rear drive. And I took apart the oil filter, and there were just some small little particles in it, which is kind of what you'd expect when you're breaking in the motor. Nothing that made me feel alarmed at all. Now I checked the valves again, and all of the stud nuts were holding at exactly 25 foot-pounds, so that was good. And they tightened up just a tiny bit. So at this point, I wanted to set the valves to normal, which according to BMW is 4 thousandths on intake and 6 thousandths on exhaust. So I reset the valves. The next thing I did was just check bolt torques on the steering and found that the acorn nut was a little loose, so I torqued it back to where it ought to be, and made sure that the engine studs were at the right torque. They seemed to be a little loose, so I tightened them up a little bit, and that is kind of normal. And one other thing I did is I checked the swing arm, and I backed off the lock nut. It was about at the right torque, and checked to be sure that the clearance gap between the swing arm and the frame was still equal, which it was, and then just reset the pivot bolt torque and torqued up the lock nut just to make sure the back end was solid. So I filled up the tank with gas and have been putting some more miles on it just to make sure everything's running smooth and everything feels right, and it has been great. So the bike is all ready for the new owner to have fun on. And as you can see, I put over 600 miles, almost 900. This is the starting mileage, and I'm at a little over 65,000 right now, 65,008.